Yeah, the issue of the veto has a long and thorny history. I think first of all it's important to remember why the veto is there. You know, the UN and the Security Council in particular, is a political body. It's not a humanitarian body, it's not a legal body, it's not a human rights body, it's a political body. It's there to take political decisions, and the veto is there to keep, for two reasons. Firstly, to keep the great powers at the table. It was learning the lesson of the League of Nations that nothing would do more harm for the new world organization than for the great powers to walk away from it. And they would walk away from it if they believed that the United Nations was acting in a way that was contrary to their interests. And that's precisely, of course, what happened to the League of Nations. So you got to a point by 1938 where you had this major world catastrophe about to happen, and none of the key players were at the table in Geneva at the League of Nations. What the veto has done is ensure that the UN, first of all, that it survived the Cold War, and at times that was no sure thing, but also that the Security Council remains at the centre of debates about international peace and security. And the Security Council has become more central. Just, you know, at the time of we go back to Iraq, at the time of the Iraq debate there was a lot of talk about the UN's irrelevance. But I would just ask people to compare the role of the Security Council in that debate with the role of the Security Council on the various wars in Indochina in the 1970s. The Council never even met formally about any of those conflicts in Indochina. Although the US ultimately decided to act without a Security Council mandate, the whole debate was in the Council, was framed in terms of Council resolutions, and framed around the Council. I see that as a sign of the growing strength and centrality of the Council. And it's the great powers stay at the table because they know they have this veto right. Now the Charter bestows upon the permanent 5 members special responsibilities for international peace and security, but it gives to them this veto to use how they see fit in pursuit of international peace and security. Now what countries typically argue when they're casting the veto these days is that they believe that the matters being proposed would be contrary to international peace and security. So, for example, what China and Russia are arguing, at least in the Council, is that more coercive measures against the Syrian government would only inflame the situation. It would encourage the rebels, who have themselves been responsible for possibly war crimes, possibly crimes against humanity, certainly for illegal arming, but it would also further antagonize the Syrian government and make it more difficult to negotiate a resolution in a context where, other than Kofi Annan's 6-point plan, there isn't a clear roadmap of how to move from where we are today to a peaceful resolution. Now that's the argument they're presenting. I'm not saying it's one I necessarily agree with, but it's one that the Charter bestows on them to make. There will always be cases like Syria where the great powers can't agree, and the Charter and the Council is designed to prevent the Council from acting in those cases. And what that does is create an enormous amount of frustration on behalf of those that would want the Council to work more on this case, as I would. But it also allows the Council to survive to fight another day. And if we look at the Council's agenda, we see 15 or 16 other situations where the Council is able to act with unanimity in relation to issues that involve the protection of civilians from these crimes and other violations. And it's able to do that in those other cases because in the cases that are most controversial, the veto allows states, the great powers in particular, to protect their vital interests. In terms of the S5 initiative, I wholly welcome it, and I think they're going about it precisely the right way. The way to build in this sort of restraint is not through trying to impose new formal rules, which will never be adopted by the Council. One thing you'll unify the P5 on is that, and that's because the P5 aren't just looking at humanitarian issues, they're looking at the full range of peace and security issues, and they're thinking, well, what if, so, you know, China will be thinking, well, if we agree to this, will that restrain our capacity, for example, to protect our friends in North Korea or Myanmar if the time comes. The US will do the same calculation in relation to Israel, for example. The last thing any American administration would want is a Security Council resolution authorizing some sort of enforcement action directed at Israeli non-compliance with past resolutions. And one thing guaranteed to get the US walking away from the UN very quickly, which would be bad, very bad for the UN as well as for the world. But I think the S5 approach of adopting it and working through the Working Methods Committee and of trying to build a culture where more stigma is attached to casting veto. And clearly we've gotten there. States don't easily cast a veto. They much prefer not to. I think the Chinese in particular are feeling very uncomfortable with the position that they've got, because China always makes a point of trying to align itself with the relevant regional organizations. If you see its past vetoes on Zimbabwe and Myanmar, in both cases it made a point of saying our veto is consistent with the stated position of the African Union and ASEAN, which on both of those cases was opposed to the imposition of sanctions. So the fact that the Chinese position is currently out of step with the League of Arab States and out of step with the General Assembly has made China fairly uncomfortable. I think Russia feels a little less uncomfortable because Russia feels that it has more interests at stake. I think it feels that some of the rhetoric coming out of the West has been fairly unhelpful. And that, of course, that sort of rhetoric, of course, backs Russia into a position where it then feels that it can't compromise, because once you raise the stakes, it becomes an issue of domestic credibility as well, and so you get this kind of disconnect between what you need to have happen diplomatically in order to win consensus and what governments need in terms of their own domestic politics. But I would underscore that despite all the frustration, and I share that frustration about the Council's inability to act more decisively on Syria, I know two things I'd underscore. Firstly, we shouldn't make the mistake, as many commentators do, of saying there has been Council inaction on Syria. Well, there hasn't. We had a 6-point peace plan. The Council has condemned atrocities. We had a UN mission on the ground. The issue is, in view of the fact that those things have failed to stem the violence, what do we do next? And in terms of the instruments that are on the table, none of them get close to definitively being able to say, this brings us to the end state. Targeted sanctions against the Assad regime in the short to medium term would be more symbolic than anything else. Most of the foreign assets are already in places where they won't be hurt by targeted sanctions. In terms of stopping cross-border flows, you just have to look at the geography of the region to realise how difficult that would be, and in terms of how you'd actually implement those mandates, there are some serious hard questions to answer. And then there are questions about the disunity within the Syrian opposition, and what is it precisely the Syrian opposition wants, and how you move from where we are today to a situation where both sides are prepared to commit to a genuine ceasefire and are prepared to commit to some sort of political process. I don't think either side are close to being there yet, and history tells us that in those situations there's not much that can be achieved through diplomacy and mediation. So we need to be conscious of the limitations of what can be achieved, and also aware of the complexities involved of interfering. But there is a danger that if you push too hard, you could do more harm than good. Syria is such a complex case. It is so difficult to get credible information about who precisely is doing what to who and why. Though I'm not saying there isn't plenty of information that shows that the government is at the very least failing to protect its population from crimes against humanity and war crimes, and is most likely implicated directly itself. I would, as an end, finally say, well, one thing I think the Council can and should do, which was talked about yesterday, and may actually be more effective than sanctions, is consider a referral to the ICC. And refer the whole situation to the ICC, just as it did, rather than saying we'll refer the government's actions to the ICC. It should say, here's a start point for when we think crimes were being committed. The ICC should investigate the commission of crimes by anybody who was doing it and bring indictments against anybody who it thinks is responsible. I think that's a tangible step forward. But I know there are even diplomats in the West who have cautioned against that, fearing that will limit the room for diplomatic manoeuvre. And that's probably true too, but I suspect that room for diplomatic manoeuvre is getting fairly small anyway.